This is a nice introduction, isn't it?
It's a wonderful introduction. Now all the clever people have left the room, or at least the stage, so it's just you and me.
It's true that we've been dealing with each other and with your services for many, many years. I remember when you came in 2015 in this very room, Alexandre may remember, we had a dinner, and we were starting to think about digital regulation. But it's clear that time has changed so much between then and also the time in 2020 when you presented formally the DMA. The evolving dynamics of relations between world players have changed so fundamentally, leading to a fragmented geopolitical landscape. But that change has affected regulation also, and digital regulation. And that's what I would like us perhaps to chat about this afternoon for, unfortunately, only 30 minutes. Now, when you proposed the Digital Markets Act, there were some critics who said Europe is regulating markets that it has already lost. Now, today, 5 years later, would you say that the DMA is about, I would say, shaping the future, or it is still mainly about containing past dominance?
Well, I don't think that you can say that anybody has lost a market where you have 450 million consumers. That's a very vibrant, valuable market. And I found it extremely telling that the Google representative said that the DMA would not suit us because it would enable also US businesses to do better in Europe. I think that makes it so obvious that this is being used in a political game. Because the point of the DMA is that anybody is welcome to come to Europe and compete. Full stop. That's the point. Because no matter where you're headquartered, if you have competition, you have innovation, you have investment, you have choice. And in the discussions about more European businesses, if the consumers are not trained in having choices, knowing they have choices, knowing that it's a valuable thing to have choices, they wouldn't even ever get to use European businesses. So the DMA is about the future. The DMA is about saving a social market economy from monopolism. Because otherwise it only goes one way. And that's a completely old school division by the mighty of the value in the marketplace.
Now, if we look ahead and looking about the future, what would be for you, what would be success for the DMA? What would still need to happen politically, institutionally, in terms of enforcement practice for us to be able to assert that the DMA is a success?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's really important to have the right expectations. I didn't have one, I didn't have two, I didn't have three. I was starting on the 4th Google case in my tenure. We had so many Amazon cases. We had Facebook Meta cases, we have Apple cases. There was no view to compliance with our normal competition laws in sight. You know, the learning curve was as flat as someone who's almost in a permanent coma. So the point was to say we need to speed up, we need to reset the game by telling those who are de facto gatekeepers what they can do and what they cannot do. But there was no expectation that this would happen overnight, that all of a sudden, because they were told in clearer terms what they knew already, because their internal counsel would have told them a gazillion times, that all of a sudden the world would be a world of complete compliance with fair trading practices and open contestable markets. And I think that's really important. And you know, if there's one thing I agree on today, it is that it needs much more resources for enforcement. And it also needs to make sure that enforcement have that double-sidedness, that it also has deterrence. Because enforcement without deterrence doesn't work. Which means that you need to have fines that are being felt. Also because fines communicate very well. Then people notice, oh, they did something wrong. Must be actually quite illegal if the fine is a couple of billions or more.
In 2015, the concepts of economic security and strategic autonomy were not so much important, but today we see that they are really framing digital policy. So do you see a direct link between the DMA and the EU's economic security strategy?
Well, one of the many amazing things that comes from competition is resilience. Because if one supplier fails you, there'll be another one. If one customer fails you, there will be another one. You know, some of the issues we have seen in the semiconductor supply chain is indeed that there are specific businesses that does very, very specific, very, very high specialized things. It may be the tiniest of screws, but they're the only ones making them. And if you have an earthquake or you have a fire, then all of a sudden the supply chain doesn't work. And that entire value chain then stops. So I think it's really important to see it in that perspective, that the point to be resilient is to have choice, not to be foreclosed, not to be kept just with one supplier or one customer.
Yeah, but can market and market contestability and competition constitute real enablers of resilience, of reduced dependency?
But of course, one of the tricky things is that it's quite rare that we are rational agents. We're also human beings with our envies and faults and complacencies and whatever. And when you have a market situation where things comes very easily to you, well, then you're not a rational agent anymore. And in Europe, we have been so lazy that we have allowed ourselves dependencies. The gas dependency on Russia, for China for critical minerals and market and production capacity, on the US for security and technology. That has become a market problem, but it comes from laziness or greed. So when you want to push yourself out of that situation, that actually means that you should be more rational and have more market in order to have more choice and more people to choose from and more people to come. And I think that is the important, that is why the DMA is so much about the future. Because an open market also underpin and support an open democracy. Because you can push that market concentration that otherwise connects with political power. And that then it becomes really difficult actually to move it.
Your successors at the Commission have made the word and the concept of simplification as one of the main drivers of their action. It's clear that we see what is presented as simplification is often, I would say, hidden deregulation. The Commission has launched a digital fitness check to review and streamline the EU digital acquis from competition and platform regulation to data, AI, cybersecurity. Now, in practical terms, what does the former competition commissioner and commissioner in charge of the digital, what outcomes do you expect from these reviews in terms of not only simplification, but also competitiveness, user protection, and economic security?
Well, who would not want to live in a simple world? I think it was one of the Greek ideals of the antique Greek, that things that were simple, they were also true. So I think it's really deep in us that we're trying to find things that are simple, that can be easily understood. The problem is that we live in a very complex world, and it's full of lawyers. And I completely agree that there is scope to do things simpler, because when you have been legislating for a very long period of time, of course there will be overlaps, and these overlaps, they will have a slightly different wording. And as a layman, you think it's the same, but your lawyer will tell you, no, 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 no. Completely different concepts. Or it may be that different pieces of legislation, they interfere with one another in different ways. I think they now use the GDPR for the Grok AI that undresses women and children. That is also a kind of a digital legislation all of a sudden. So you have interference between different pieces of legislation. You have legislation that was not made digitally ready, because digital wasn't a thing at the time. So I agree that there is scope for simplification. And I think that is also legitimate. The problem is if there is a push and that slides into deregulation in a way that is not democratically discussed. Because then the aims, they sort of quietly changes. And then it's not legitimate anymore. And then all of a sudden you have problems in Parliament. Because they see it and they say, well, this was not it. This was not what we were going to do. And then all of a sudden things get stuck and it doesn't work anymore. So I think it's really important to be careful, to say what is it that we want to do here. And also to say, well, if we want things to be really simple, then they will not always be just, at least not to everybody. Because if you want things that are sort of justified in the sort of measurement of millimeters, then you need really complex rules. I'd say that in such a complex world, it could be a good idea to push it, to say, we have simple rules, it's one rule, it's all over the territory, it's with very few enforcers. But then it has to be legitimate, because then a lot of details, they disappear. So I hope in the coming months that it's a review. It's looking into what have we learned about the DMA, the first years of the enforcement. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? Because I'll never claim that it was perfect when it was first made, because we were humans making it. And then try to figure out what that is then take. But my guess would be that first things first, you need people, you need resources, and you need to be allowed to enforce.
In his first mandate, the current president of the United States called you the tax lady. And since then, digital regulation has become an even bigger point of friction between the EU and the United States. How, in your view, should we respond? Should Europe respond to US pressure on our regulatory choices? And can we do so without undermining our own legal and political autonomy?
So the first thing is that it's not new. You know, one of the first things when I came to Brussels was a letter, I think, from the US Congress with numerous signatories. Now, welcome to this office. The European Commission has done everything wrong before you came. We really hope that you will do better, something like that. It's a disgrace, because you're targeting US companies. Went on and on and on and on and on. You know, I don't know, 70 signatories. I basically got one of those letters every year. But in the end, there was only 12 signatories. And the change was that the US voters had changed their mind. Because 10, 15 years ago, you know, big tech was the best thing since sliced bread. Not anymore. There's an afterthought because of the scandals, because of the whistleblowers, because of the fears of your mental health, of your democracy, of your communities. This is why you now have privacy legislation in 15 states of the United States. This is why you have AI regulation in so many states of the United States. Because people don't see it as they did. And this is also why I think one should be really careful not to overlook the other side of the equation, which is that Europeans were promised that markets would be open and contestable. They were promised to have choice. They were promised that businesses could do their business based on their ideas, their talent, their work ethics, their investors, but not because of gatekeepers. That was the promise made, and that promise is as important as it is to say to an American president, well, it's only some of your businesses that you promote, because most of our cases, they are based on other US businesses who fail to feel that they can do business in Europe because of other businesses headquartered in the US.
What you are saying is that that kind of narrative would be useful now.
But it's not only useful, it's just simple registering the facts. That so many US businesses, they have benefited from European competition law enforcement. First they complain and then they get the benefit, and I think it's the same thing now. And it has been extremely valuable for the European Commission because they come with data, they come with their insights, they come with the knowledge about how the different markets and sub-markets actually work. And I think it's very important to maintain this because the DMA and competition law enforcement is not about European businesses, it's about competition. But you need to have competition in order for people to have choice. And you cannot have choice without other businesses. And they can be American, and they can be European, and some will be Chinese, and so on and so forth.
We talk competition, we could talk also about industrial policy. In 2015, industrial policy was still considered in Brussels, to say the least, I would say, as odd as a concept. Today, in the bubble, and also in a significant number of member states, you can advocate for a smart EU industrial policy without anymore being considered as an heretic. Now, on the supply side, we see a number of initiatives, such as you mentioned, the semiconductor and AI infrastructure investments. On demand sides, debates are going on concerning buy European approaches. So how should the EU, in your view, reduce critical digital dependencies without sliding into mere protectionism?
Well, first and foremost, it would be great to have a European industrial policy. Because what we have is basically a coordination, or not even that, of national industrial policies. And one of the differences between the US and China and Europe is not the level of state aid, it is that we know who gets the money, and it's transparent. It's not that businesses do not get support from their governments. The problem for me is that it's not with the European approach. It's not in order to make sure that the market works better. That is the problem. And I also think that sometimes it's a bit, one doesn't see when you say smart industrial policy, that the European ecosystems, they're a bit different. Take ASML, amazing company. Must visit destination if you want to do semiconductors. But they are the visible part of an ecosystem of more than 100 businesses in their geographic vicinity. And the amazing thing of ASML comes from the innovation of all these businesses that inspire one another, and they each do their part. And I think it's really important when you think about industrial policy that you think about this, because a lot of people, they still think about politicians pouring money into big companies. And that is not going to help us. So I think first and foremost, the European approach, and second, that we think much more about market creation. We traditionally do a lot on the supply side, enabling infrastructures on the supply side. But we do very little on the demand side. We think that public procurement is enough, but public procurement that's not strategic is not enough. One could be much more strategic in your public procurement than what you are today. Because of course, as a business, it's very nice to have some grant. It's also nice that somebody comes and gives you advice, especially if they know something about your business. But very often, the best thing you can have is customers. It's a great thing. And one of the things I think they have done really well in the US is that they have DARPA and they have other innovation vehicles. And if something seems interesting, the US Army says, we'll buy 100,000 of those. And that is a bing to investors. Because if you have an anchor customer that will buy 100,000, well, then probably others will as well. And then the investors come. So, you know, my wish is that I think the most important industrial policy you could do was to say, well, now when everybody's having increased defense budgets, let's just take a slice of that and make the wildest innovation fund that you have seen with very little strings attached.
We are the center on regulation in Europe. I'd be interested to know what is your view on the changing nature of regulation in the age of geopolitics and power. We see global megatrends which are blurring the boundaries between regulation, economic policy, geopolitics. So how has this changed the nature of regulation itself, in particular in the digital domain?
Well, I think it's part of this so-called race that we're in. A race with no ending and with no price. And I think it's really important for us to be in the race to be the best possible Europe. We would be lousy Chinese anyway. So for us to be better Europeans. And that entails that we really hail our democratic processes, democratic legitimacy, the rule of law, that we're checked by the courts. And I think that is absolutely essential, because from that comes legitimacy. And if we get wobbly on that, well, I think we are losing one of the reasons as to why it's so good to be European and live in Europe.
My final question, because unfortunately our time is nearly past, is about the Commission. The Commission proposes laws, enforces them, evaluates their impact, coordinates industrial policy, and acts as a geopolitical actor, and all this sometimes simultaneously. And some people, and you heard earlier in the conversation this afternoon, that some people may argue that these accumulated responsibilities generate overstretch and perhaps sometimes conflict of interest. So do you see tensions in these overlapping roles, for instance, between being a lawmaker, an evaluator, and regulator? And you believe that the Commission institutional models remains today still fit for purpose in the digital age?
I think it was meant to be that way, because it comes from the treaty. This is not something new. This was always the case. What I find one should watch is the Commission in itself being more political in its deliberations. And I think we are at risk of losing something which is really, really special globally, the role of the Commission. Because there's no lack of politics in Europe. That's enough. What we do not have are bodies that are bound by something that is above the party politics of each and every one of us. And I'd say the commissions that I were part of, believe it or not, but it was the reality that the treaty was more important than whether we were liberals or social democrats or conservatives. Because it was really special what we had. That, I think one should be really careful in protecting. And the second thing, if one says, no, we need an independent competition agency, the next question is why? Because you will get weaker competition law enforcement. Because the point of having competition law enforcement in the Commission is that you have somebody who personalizes, who embody competition and competition law enforcement every day of the week in front of colleagues who might wish it in another place.
Margrethe Vestager, thank you very, very much. It was really, really a treat to have this conversation with you. Thank you.